A cold case dating back nearly a half century appears to have been cracked this week. Investigators in Pennsylvania arrested David Sinopoli in the 1975 murder of 19-year-old Lindy Sue Biechler.
Picture this, a coffee cup, just a regular throwaway coffee cup, tossed in an airport trash can like 100,000 other cups get tossed every single day. Nobody looks twice at a coffee cup, except this one ended a secret that a man had been carrying for nearly 50 years. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a single DNA swab from a discarded cup unraveled a murder that happened before most of us were even born. Stick with me, because the way investigators finally cracked this case is honestly one of the wildest things I've ever covered, and the ending is going to hit you harder than you expect. Let's go back to December 1975. If you want to picture the mood of the country that year, think about this. The last helicopters had just lifted off the roof of the embassy in Saigon. President Ford had just signed the pardon for Nixon. People were glued to their TVs, and there was this heavy, uneasy feeling in the air, like the country wasn't quite sure what to believe anymore. That's the backdrop. Now zoom into a much smaller, much quieter place. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, about 2 hours west of Philadelphia. This is Amish country. Tobacco fields, cornfields, small apartment complexes tucked right up against farmland. The kind of place where, in 1975, people genuinely didn't lock their doors. Why would they? Nothing bad happened here. Everybody knew everybody, or at least felt like they did. Neighbors waved from their porches. It was the kind of community where a knock on your door in the evening usually meant a friendly face, not danger. That sense of safety is going to matter a lot as this story unfolds, because it's exactly what made what happened next so unthinkable to everyone who lived there. In that county lived a 19-year-old woman named Lindy Sue Biechler. People who knew her describe her the same way, over and over. Long hair, a gentle, easy smile. She worked at a local floral shop. She was newly married to a man named Phil Biechler, and the two of them were building the kind of life a lot of us dream about. Nothing flashy, no grand plans, just two young people starting out together in a small apartment at a place called Spring Manor, on Kloss Drive in Manor Township. Now here's where I need you to pay close attention, because this detail matters a lot later. On the afternoon of December 5th, 1975, Lindy ran a few errands. She stopped at the bank to deposit her and Phil's paycheck. She went grocery shopping. She came home, set the grocery bags down on the dining table, and didn't even get around to unpacking them. Somewhere between 6:45 and 9 o'clock that evening, inside her own living room, Lindy Sue Biechler was attacked. And she fought. I want to be really clear about this, because it matters for understanding who did this to her. She did not go down easy. She fought with everything she had. Her attacker came at her with 2 knives, one he brought with him, and one he grabbed from her own kitchen. She was stabbed 19 times. Neck, chest, stomach, back. Later that evening, her aunt and uncle stopped by. They were just coming over to swap some recipes, completely normal, completely ordinary. They knocked, they walked in, and what they found in that living room is something neither of them would ever be able to unsee for the rest of their lives. Lindy was on the floor. One of the knives was still in her neck, and wrapped around the handle of that knife was a dish towel. Think about that for a second. That's not panic. That's not rage that just happens and stops. Someone paused, in the middle of doing this, to grab a towel so he wouldn't leave fingerprints. That tells you something chilling about the kind of person police were dealing with. Calm enough, even in that moment, to think about covering his tracks. Police arrived that night to a scene that told a brutal story. Clear signs of a violent struggle. Evidence of a sexual assault. A man's footprint left behind in the kitchen. The autopsy would later confirm what the scene already suggested. Severe blood loss as the cause of death, and defensive wounds on Lindy's hands and arms. She wasn't caught off guard and killed instantly. She fought back, hard, the entire time. And here's a detail investigators zeroed in on almost immediately. The attack happened in this narrow, specific window, after Lindy got home, but before Phil was due back. That's not random. A stranger passing through doesn't know that window. Whoever did this knew Lindy's schedule, knew when she'd be alone, knew exactly when to make his move. So Lancaster County Police went to work. They formed a task force. They brought in outside criminologists. Phil, as you'd expect in any case like this, was questioned and cleared almost right away. There was nothing connecting him to it. Investigators talked to neighbors in the 4-unit building. They talked to Lindy's co-workers at the floral shop. Eventually, they interviewed 300 people. 300. Think about the sheer scale of that effort in a county that small. And it led nowhere. No fingerprints that matched anyone. The footprint went cold. Not one of those 300 interviews produced a name worth chasing. The case stalled out completely. But there was one piece of evidence that survived all of it: a semen sample recovered from Lindy's underwear. In 1975, there was no DNA technology on Earth that could do anything useful with that sample. So investigators did the only thing they could do. They documented it, packaged it, labeled it, filed it away. They didn't know what it would ever be good for. They just knew, somehow, that it mattered. And they held on to it. They had no idea they'd be holding on to it for almost 50 years. Now stay with me here, because the story goes quiet for a long time, and that silence is actually part of what makes this case so remarkable. Through the 80s and into the 90s, that file just sat there, the oldest open case in the county, passed down from one generation of investigators to the next, each one picking it up, reading through it, and setting it back down with the same feeling of helplessness as the person before them. In the 90s, DNA testing finally became a real tool in American law enforcement. For the first time since that December night, investigators could actually do something with that semen sample. They ran it against CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database, and the result came back empty. No match. Whoever did this had no criminal record, nothing in the system. He was, as far as any database was concerned, a ghost. Fast forward to 2019. Lancaster County had just set up a cold case unit inside the district attorney's office, and they decided to try something different. They sent the DNA sample to a lab called Parabon Nanolabs and asked them to build a predicted face, basically using the genetic markers in that sample to generate an image of what the killer might have looked like at 25 years old, back when the crime happened. In September 2019, they released those images to the public, along with a plea for tips, and nothing came of it. The case went right back to being ice cold. Meanwhile, life in Lancaster County kept moving forward. New neighborhoods went up over old farmland. Entire generations grew up who'd never even heard the name Lindy Sue Biechler. But Phil Biechler, the 20-year-old husband who lost his wife in the very first year of their marriage, kept aging with a question that never got answered. And somewhere in that same county, the man who did this was aging right alongside him, going to work, living his life, completely unbothered. Now here's where things start moving again, and I promise you, this next part is worth the wait. In April of 2018, the whole country was riveted by a case out of California. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, a man responsible for at least 13 murders and more than 50 sexual assaults through the 70s and 80s, was finally arrested after more than 4 decades on the run. And the thing that caught him wasn't a fingerprint or a tip. It was an entirely new technique called investigative genetic genealogy. Instead of searching criminal databases for the suspect's own DNA, investigators searched public genealogy websites for his relatives, and then built out family trees until the branches narrowed down to one man. The Lancaster County Cold Case Unit was watching that story closely, and in 2020, they reached out to a genetic genealogist named C.C. Moore, someone who had already helped crack hundreds of cold cases across the country using this exact method. When Moore opened the Biechler file, she realized almost instantly that this case was going to be unlike anything she'd worked before. In a typical genetic genealogy case, investigators find matches at the level of second or third cousins, people who share a great-grandparent, maybe a great-great-grandparent. That's usually enough to build a family tree and zero in on a suspect within a few generations. But in this case, the closest matches Moore could find in the entire public database were incredibly distant. These were people whose most recent shared ancestor with the killer went back 3, maybe 400 years. We're talking the 16 or 1700s. Nothing about this could be solved the normal way. Moore had to invent a new approach on the spot, tracing a family tree not across a few decades, but across centuries. She later called it the hardest case of her entire career. After months of painstaking work, Moore and her team found the one thing every single DNA match in that database had in common. No matter where these people ended up living, Pennsylvania, or anywhere else in the country, their ancestors all traced back to the exact same place. A tiny village called Gasparina, tucked away in the Calabria region of southern Italy. So think about what that means for a second. A DNA sample sitting in a lab in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, led investigators all the way back to a village in 17th century Italy. And then they had to trace it forward again, generation by generation, following the families that eventually emigrated, to figure out which one of those bloodlines ended up settling in Lancaster County. This wasn't a quick database search. This was old-school genealogical detective work, stretched across an ocean and hundreds of years. Ship manifests, church records, immigration papers, census data, piecing together which descendants of that one Calabrian village crossed the Atlantic, where they settled, who they married, and which branch of that enormous family tree eventually planted roots just a few miles from Lindy Sue Biechler's apartment. It's the kind of painstaking work that could easily take a lifetime, and Moore and her team did it in a matter of months. Moore cross-referenced that information against local genealogy records for families with roots in Gasparina. It was a small, specific pool of people. She narrowed it further by age, by gender, slowly eliminating names that didn't fit the profile. And the list got shorter and shorter, until one name was left standing out among the rest. David Sinopoli, 68 years old, living quietly in East Hempfield Township, not far at all from where Lindy Sue Biechler had been killed, a man who had lived in that same county for 47 straight years. No criminal record, no police file, nothing, in nearly half a century, that would have made a single investigator or a single neighbor connect him to that apartment at Spring Manor. And then investigators found the detail that made everything click into place. In 1975, David Sinopoli lived in that exact 4-unit building, the same building as Lindy and Phil. He wasn't some stranger who slipped in off the street. He was their neighbor, someone Lindy probably passed in the hallway, someone she might have said a quick hello to without a second thought, and in 47 years his name had never once come up. Not a single tip, not once. Now, once Sinopoli's name landed on Moore's list, investigators knew they had to be incredibly careful about what they did next. If they walked up and knocked on his door, they'd tip him off. He could destroy evidence, lawyer up, disappear. And besides, a family tree match, no matter how solid, wasn't enough on its own for a court order compelling his DNA. They needed something they could actually use. They needed his DNA voluntarily discarded, in public, the kind of evidence a court would accept without question. So they waited, quietly, patiently. They started watching his routine, where he went, what he did, just watching, and waiting for the one moment he'd throw something away without thinking twice about it. That moment came on February 11, 2022. David Sinopoli was at Philadelphia International Airport. He bought a coffee, he drank it, and when he was done, he did what literally all of us do every single day. He tossed the cup in the trash. Investigators were right there. They recovered that cup the second it hit the bin and sent it straight to the lab. And here's the moment that ends 47 years of silence. The DNA on that discarded coffee cup matched the semen DNA collected from Lindy Sue Biechler's underwear back in 1975. The match probability came back at roughly 1 in 10 trillion. It was also confirmed against bloodstains on her clothing. There was no ambiguity left, none. On July 17, 2022, investigators showed up at David Sinopoli's home in East Hempfield Township and arrested him. 46 years, 7 months, and 12 days after Lindy Sue Biechler was murdered. The next day, District Attorney Heather Adams stood in front of a room full of reporters at the Lancaster County Courthouse and announced that the oldest unsolved case in the county's history had finally been closed. And honestly, I think what shook that community wasn't just that they'd caught him, it was the realization of what that meant. This man hadn't been hiding in some other state, living under a fake name. He had been right there, the entire time, going to the grocery store, getting his mail, living an ordinary, unremarkable life just a few miles from where he killed a 19-year-old woman for 47 years, while everyone around him had absolutely no idea. Adams put it simply at that press conference. She said the case was solved because of how far DNA technology had come, and that honestly, without it, there was a real chance it never would have been solved at all. And somewhere in Lancaster County, Phil Biechler, the young husband who walked out the door one ordinary morning in December 1975 and came home to find his entire life shattered, finally, after 47 years, had an answer. A name, a face, a man in custody. Now here's where the story could have gone one of two ways. It could have dragged into a long, drawn-out trial, with a jury and witnesses and months of arguments. But that's not what happened. Sinopoli sat in jail for over a year awaiting trial, and eventually made the decision not to fight it in court. On October 19, 2023, at 69 years old, he walked into a Lancaster County courtroom and pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. And in that courtroom, the prosecution did something that I think is worth pausing on. Assistant District Attorney Christine Wilson placed a photo of Lindy Sue Biechler right next to where Sinopoli was sitting, so for the entire proceeding, he had to sit beside her face. Wilson turned to him directly and told him these cases are never forgotten, that Lindy Sue would never be forgotten, and that while he'd gotten to go on living his life for almost 50 years, Lindy never got that chance, and she told him to look at the life he took. Witnesses in that courtroom said Sinopoli barely reacted. No visible remorse, nothing on his face. Not a flinch, not a tear, nothing that resembled what you'd expect from a man confronted with a photo of the woman he'd killed nearly 5 decades earlier. For everyone watching, that blankness was almost harder to process than if he'd broken down completely. The judge, David Ashworth, didn't hold back either. He described the harm Sinopoli caused as almost impossible to fully grasp, and he made a point of noting something important, that Sinopoli was only pleading guilty because he'd been caught with overwhelming evidence, not because of any genuine remorse or conscience. Phil Biechler stood up that day too. Decades later, he finally got to say something directly to the man who took his wife from him. He told Sinopoli that he'd stolen a massive part of his life and caused suffering that couldn't even be measured, and that while everyone else had to live with what he did, he got to just keep living his. When the judge gave Sinopoli the chance to speak, he offered one single sentence. He said he wanted to apologize to everyone, including his wife. That was it. No explanation for why he was in that apartment that night. No reason given for 19 stab wounds. Not one word about what actually happened on December 5, 1975. The question everyone in that room desperately wanted answered, why, was never addressed. And it probably never will be. Judge Ashworth sentenced him to 25 to 50 years in prison. And here's an interesting legal detail. That sentence had to be based on the maximum penalties allowed under Pennsylvania law back in 1975, the year the crime actually happened, not the laws in place when he was finally caught in 2022. He was also ordered to pay a little over $25,000 in prosecution costs. At 69 years old, a 25 to 50-year sentence is, for all practical purposes, a life sentence. David Sinopoli will die in prison. Meanwhile, Phil Biechler and Lindy's family go on living with a loss that nothing can ever really repair. After sentencing, DA Heather Adams told reporters that justice had finally caught up to Lindy Sue Biechler's killer, thanks to the persistence of investigators across multiple agencies over decades, and thanks to DNA analysis that pinpointed him with total precision. Assistant DA Wilson added something that's really stuck with me, that Sinopoli spent 48 years thinking he'd gotten away with it completely, while the people who never stopped working the case, combined with how far DNA science had advanced, finally proved him wrong. Now, this case never became a headline-grabbing true crime documentary. There's no law named after Lindy Sue Biechler, no foundation carrying her name into the future. But inside the world of genetic genealogists, the people who specialize in cracking cold cases using exactly this kind of DNA and family tree work, this case is talked about differently than almost any other, because it was, by a wide margin, the hardest one C.C. Moore had ever tackled. Tracing a family tree back 4 centuries, from a lab in Pennsylvania all the way to a tiny village in southern Italy, and then walking it forward again through generations of migration to land on one specific man. Nobody had ever attempted anything like that before. And because it worked, that method is now being used on other cold cases that investigators had genuinely given up on. That's the real legacy here. A technique born out of pure necessity, because this case was simply too hard to crack any other way. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a few things this case really drives home, because they're worth thinking about in your own life, not just as a story you watch and forget. Lock your doors. Always. Even in a quiet neighborhood. Even if you know everyone around you. Even if you're only stepping out for 20 minutes. Back in 1975, Lancaster County was the kind of place where almost nobody locked up, because nobody thought they needed to. And that sense of safety is exactly what let someone walk right in. Be thoughtful about the people living closest to you. Not because every neighbor is dangerous, most obviously aren't, but because the person you'd least suspect is often exactly who you should be paying attention to. Sinopoli wasn't a stranger. He was someone Lindy likely passed in the hallway without a second thought. Tell someone your schedule, not a vague, "I'll be back later," but something specific, when you're leaving, when you expect to be home, and who to call if you're not. Lindy didn't have anyone tracking that narrow window she'd be alone, and whoever did this to her clearly did. And trust your gut. If someone around you gives you a bad feeling for no clear reason, don't brush that off as being paranoid. That instinct exists for a reason. And maybe the biggest takeaway of all, DNA doesn't forget, and it doesn't lie. It took 47 years, a discarded coffee cup, and a genealogist willing to trace a bloodline back 400 years to a village most Americans have never heard of. But in the end, it caught up with him. No matter how cold a case goes, it is never actually closed. Somewhere, in a lab, on a shelf, that one piece of evidence might still be waiting for the technology to finally catch up to it. If this case hit you the way it hit me, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because trust me, there are more cases like this one coming, and some of them are even harder to believe. Some of the cases waiting in this channel's queue involve DNA that sat in evidence lockers even longer than this one, cracked open by the very same genetic genealogy techniques that finally caught up with David Sinopoli. So if stories like this one keep you thinking about how close some killers came to getting away with it forever, this is exactly the kind of channel you'll want to stick around for.